Hey there guys, Nordic Warrior here, welcome back to my channel. So today we're going to be doing something a little bit different on the channel. We're going to be talking about a particular gaming topic that's been on my mind a lot. I want to start by saying that the title of this video is a bit of an exaggeration, and the reason for the title will become clear if you hear what I have to say. So lately I've been working on several pretty large projects for the channel, mostly involving retrospective reviews. This year in particular I've been doing a lot of anniversary videos, since it's a good excuse for me to talk about certain games that may have a bit of renewed interest in them due to them being a certain number of years old. It just so happens that several of the games I've been covering are open world, sandbox style games. Now my history with open world games has always been a bit of a mixed bag. I've always been pretty much in two minds about them, even back in the day. As long-time subscribers of mine will probably know, I've been a gamer since the late 90s, and have seen several generations of gaming come and go, and my standards for games has always been consistent. When it comes to my overall criticisms of games, I prioritise one thing over everything else, and that is fun. Is the game I'm playing fun? And of course, for a game to be fun, it has to have several qualities, such as satisfying gameplay, level design, pacing, style, atmosphere, and, depending on who you ask, story and writing. Though I'd argue that gameplay and level design are important above every other attribute in regards to whether or not a game is fun. When it comes to open world games, I've played a lot of them over the years, and have never really been able to make up my mind whether or not it's a gaming genre that I prefer over more traditional games. If you would even consider open world a genre in itself, and I think that's an open question. What I'm trying to say is that I'm not one of these people who just hates on any open world game for the sake of it, and I know that people like that do exist, and I'm not necessarily saying that those people are wrong, nor are they right. It's all entirely subjective, of course. What I am saying is that I am, and have always been, neutral on open world games in general, and I critique each of them individually and on their own merit. From what I remember as a kid, my first experience of open world gaming was GTA 3, which was of course one of the games that really helped to popularise open world gaming. When GTA 3 came out, there was nothing else like it on the market, at least not on consoles, and widely appealing to mainstream gamers. You did have the old Elder Scrolls games on PC, which were a lot less known, but you still get the point I'm trying to make. GTA 3 was huge, and so many game studios tried to piggyback off of its success with numerous clones and imitations. Some of them were actually pretty good, others not so much. Sadly, this later led to a massive change in the gaming industry that, in my personal opinion, is still to this day ruining a lot of game franchises, and I had to talk about it. You see, open world games have their place in the industry, but the problem is that so many developers who would otherwise make more traditional style games, with more of an emphasis on gameplay and level design, instead decided to make near enough every franchise an open world sandbox game. For example, look at all the Ubisoft games that get released nearly every year nowadays, all of them as wide as an ocean, but as shallow as a puddle, in regards to their overall content. So much so, that most of them end up feeling like a complete waste of time. Let's talk a bit about my own history with open world games, and a few unpopular opinions I've always had on them. As I said before, GTA 3 was my first introduction to the genre, and it's definitely a game that for its time was pretty epic. Sure, it has some aged mechanics, but that's to be expected given the technical limitations of the time. And its sequel, Vice City, I absolutely loved as a kid. It's a game that took everything that was good about GTA 3, and improved and expanded upon it in pretty much every way, adding new vehicles, better combat, more weapons, a more interesting map, and a hilarious and well written story that was a blast to play through. Then a couple years later, Rockstar made what in my personal opinion is still to this day the greatest game they ever made, San Andreas. Sadly though, Rockstar in my personal opinion changed big time after San Andreas, and not for the better. And I've never really been a big fan of Rockstar ever since, because GTA 4, which came out in 2008, and was the first game in the series for the HD era, receiving a massive amount of hype and promotion, was another game that was widely influential. Me personally, I hated GTA 4. I hated it when it first came out, and I still feel the same way about it. I've never liked that game. In my personal opinion, it's one of the most overrated games of all time. It was basically a tech demo, disguised as a game. A boring, empty open world, with absolutely no replay value whatsoever. Slow, clunky, unresponsive controls, boring combat, horrible ragdoll physics that made it an absolute chore to play, and some of the most boring, repetitive missions in the entire series. I have never, for the life of me, understood why people like that game so much. To each their own. If you like the game, it's fine, but I just don't get it. And GTA wasn't the only series that followed this trend. Assassin's Creed came out the previous year, and it had the exact same problems as GTA 4. A boring, dull, lifeless open world, slow, clunky tank controls, and in my opinion the whole thing was just a snooze fest. But hey, obviously my opinion was in the minority, because both Rockstar and Ubisoft received almost unanimous praise from casual gamers and critics alike, and they only worsened over time in regards to their overall game design. Well, not entirely, because Red Dead Redemption 1 was a great game in my opinion, and I think it bucked the trend, but if I'm being perfectly honest, I think that was in spite of Rockstar's game development. As for Assassin's Creed, they basically released the same thing year after year, with barely any noteworthy changes at all. And fans continue to buy the games without asking questions about them, and the same goes for the Far Cry series. Sure, Far Cry 3 was a great game for the most part, but Ubisoft keeps releasing the same thing over and over again, with barely any changes to the actual gameplay formula, and barely anyone seems to notice. I don't know about you guys, but I am sick and tired of these games, where you basically trek across a lifeless sandbox and activate towers for no reason. Even the Shadow of Mordor games, which were fun action-adventure games for the most part, were affected by this BS. Unnecessary open world, activating towers stuff, it's just so boring and repetitive, and it flat out ruins otherwise great games. This brings me to the main reason why I wanted to make this video in the first place, and the thing that really set it in motion for me, Red Dead Redemption 2. Now, this is the part of the video that I suspect is going to get me a lot of backlash. Red Dead Redemption 2 is coming up on its 5th year anniversary, and I figured this would be a great opportunity for me to finally review the game. I personally loved the first game, in spite of its problems, because yeah, the game was flawed in some ways, mostly due to Rockstar, and their obsession with tech demo style realism in their games. But I thought the first game had an incredible story, with some great writing, interesting characters, and a genuinely well made open world, with plenty of variety in both the mission design, as well as the locations. In short, I really enjoyed the first game, and I had a lot of fun with it. And I always have fun when I go back to it. So it's only fitting that I play and review the sequel, especially since the game is generally regarded by critics, as well as general gamers, as one of the greatest games ever made. Here's the problem though. When Red Dead Redemption 2 first came out, back in 2018, for some reason I just couldn't bring myself to buy it. I think this was mostly because I was getting really bored of open world games, and I just couldn't be bothered with it. I bought the game 2 years later in 2020, and attempted to play it, and immediately I was worried. Because it became very clear to me right away that the game was essentially a glorified tech demo. I mean, the first 2 or so hours of the game is literally a tutorial. One that has you dragging your way through snow, travelling back and forth to the same locations over and over again, and repeating the same boring mechanics, watching long, bloated cutscenes, with the developers basically showing off their graphics and in-game physics, rather than actually letting you play the game. I took a break from the game for a while, around about the time that Dutch and the gang moved to a new camp. That was enough for me, and I didn't play the game again until about 3 years later. The reason I decided to continue playing when I did, aside from wanting to review it for its 5th anniversary, is because I kept hearing that after the tutorial, and when you finally get to explore the open world and progress in the story, the game becomes the greatest thing since sliced bread. And lo and behold, that isn't the case. I'm sorry guys, I know I'm going to get backlash for this, but the game is so boring. Legitimately one of the most boring, repetitive and flat out mind-numbing games I have ever played. An absolutely perfect example of style over substance, something I've talked about on the channel before. The game is an absolute chore to play. There is no fun to be had anywhere, the open world is bland and boring, the missions are pretty much all the same. Go to a location, talk to a character, get on your horse, ride halfway across the region of the map, which usually takes about 10 minutes, talk to another character, shoot dozens of the same faceless, nameless enemies over and over again, ride back to the start, rinse and repeat. That's the entire game, start to finish. Absolutely boring. A complete and utter waste of time. And for me it sums up everything that's wrong with the state of modern gaming. All the casual gamers and mainstream critics are absolutely obsessed with graphics, so much so to the point where a game as boring and as lame as Red Dead Redemption 2, which was basically a tech demo, or any of the copy and paste Assassin's Creed sequels, get nothing but praise from these mainstream critics and casual gamers, and get labelled some of the greatest games of all time. It's the reason why Far Cry 3 has been butchered over the years, with the same thing being re-released over and over again, with a slightly different background. Why we end up with games like Fallout 4 that completely watered down the RPG elements from previous games to try to appeal to the GTA, Ubisoft crowd. Mediocre is the best way to describe that game. It's like all a game has to do nowadays is have photorealistic character models and graphics, and some annoying ragdoll physics, and modern gamers and critics start basically spunking up its back and throwing money at it. It honestly winds me up, because clearly the standards for modern gaming has gone so far down over the years that I don't even really know how to put it into words. I mean, how does a game like Fallout 4, that was so broken it was barely playable, and barely even worked half the time, yet so many overwhelmingly positive reviews, that game runs like absolute crap, and doesn't even have the RPG elements that Fallout 3 or New Vegas had. Oh, but it had good graphics though, at least for 2015. How did Red Dead Redemption 2, a game that had you stumbling around like a drunken idiot every time you tried to walk in a straight line, had you wasting hours on end with pointless travelling and just general time wasting mechanics, not to mention numerous bugs and glitches that only waste your time even more? How does that manage to get labelled one of the greatest games ever made? I mean seriously, it's a tech demo, but it's one of the greatest games of all time. I just don't get it, man, it makes no sense to me. Since when did graphical fidelity and ragdoll physics become more important than actual fun gameplay? I mean, I had more fun playing The Simpsons Hit and Run than I did playing any of these big, bloated, open-world AAA games. And don't get me wrong, Hit and Run is a flawed game, that game certainly has its issues. But at least the game is fun, and it feels like a genuine game and not a tech demo. Since when did running around a bland open sandbox, activating towers, become a common gameplay mechanic? When did walking in a straight line, watching 20 hours of cutscenes, and having player agency completely removed by the developer become an industry standard? What on earth happened to modern gaming? In short, I am so sick and tired of open world games, to the point where I'm actually considering avoiding them altogether. Once I get my reviews out the way, of course. So what I want to do for the next part of this video is talk about what I personally think makes a good open world game, and highlight several open world games that in my personal opinion are a good example of how to do open world gaming right. Now obviously I mentioned already a couple of games. I mentioned some of the older GTA games such as Vice City, which, while flawed in some ways, again just like Hit and Run, at least Vice City was a game. At least it was actually fun to play. And obviously San Andreas, which is a certified classic. You know, back before Rockstar were making tech demos and when they were making actual games. The first Red Dead Redemption, of course I already mentioned, I really like that game, in spite of some of its problems. Some of the older Fallout games, and I'm sure I don't need to tell you guys about Skyrim. Everybody knows Skyrim's a masterpiece, but I digress. So here's a few more games that in my opinion do open world gaming right, and I think these games are a prime example of games that despite their technical limitations were able to become so immersive and had so much replay value. So the first game I'll talk about is an acquired taste, but it's a personal favourite of mine. In fact, it definitely is my favourite open world game of all time. And that's Morrowind. Morrowind, as far as I'm concerned, is a perfect example of substance over style, as well as quality over quantity. It's not the biggest game ever. In fact, when compared to some of the other examples I've given in this video, it's actually quite small. It's a game that has player progression, with a leveling up system that is always active. Every single thing you do in the game increases a particular skill or ability, and the game has a genuine reason to explore its open world and see what it has to offer, because every town, every settlement and every region is different. There are numerous quests, numerous side activities, numerous factions, each with their own agendas and ideologies, as well as more player agency and freedom of choice than pretty much any RPG since. Yeah, Morrowind has crappy graphics and very little voice dialogue, but again, style over substance. The open world in Morrowind never feels empty. There are always quests to find, always factions to interact with, and always NPCs to interact with. And a progression system that makes every single move worthwhile. Nothing in the game feels like a waste of time. And the same can't be said for any of these modern open world games that are basically tech demos. Another example of a game that did open world gaming right is Batman Arkham City. Again, it's a game that isn't that big compared to a lot of other open world games. But the thing is, it didn't need to be, because bigger isn't always better. The game had no filler, no boring, pretentious tech demo sections, and every single section of the game is jam-packed full of content. It had everything you could ever want from a game of its kind, it really did. Another good example, and I know this one's going to be controversial, Saints Row the Third. I've got mixed feelings on the Saints Row series in general, and ever since the first one they've basically been regarded as GTA clones, at least by a lot of casual gamers. But for me, the second and third Saints Row games, particularly the third in my opinion, are the complete opposite to GTA. Those games took all the stuff that worked about GTA and trimmed the fat, so to speak. They didn't have any of the boring, walking simulator, tech demo stuff, none of the slow, clunky, broken controls and mechanics. Those games had none of that crap. They were instead fun, fast-paced action-adventure games that just happened to be open world. They didn't have the same restrictions, lack of player agency, or nerfed gameplay mechanics as the modern GTA games, for example. For me, Saints Row the Third is an absolute masterpiece and a certified underrated classic. Why? Because the game is fun, and it prioritizes fun over everything else. It didn't need photorealistic character models and graphics. It didn't need annoying ragdoll physics and walking simulator sections. In fact, the game even had a side activity parodying the ragdoll effects. Seriously, despite getting panned by critics, Saints Row the Third is one of the most fun open world games I've ever played. I don't care if the game doesn't have realistic physics or towers that you need to climb and activate. In short, for me the formula to making a great open world game is to have a world that is quality over quantity. So don't make it too big, just for the sake of it being big and showing off your game's technicalities and graphics. Make sure there's no filler, no hidden loading screens, no clunky unresponsive controls, and don't add too many boring cutscenes that repeat themselves. And remember to prioritize gameplay over aesthetics, and fill the open world with interesting and unique characters, factions and side activities, as well as quests and reasons to undertake these quests. Quality over quantity, substance over style. So yeah, that pretty much sums up my own personal views on open world games, and I hope I made myself perfectly clear. So you guys know, and I shouldn't really have to say this, but with this being the internet I might as well, just in case. This is all entirely my own opinion, and you know what they say about opinions, everyone's got one. So anyway, that pretty much wraps up the video. Let me know what you guys think. Those are my thoughts on open world gaming. Thanks for watching and God bless.
Nothing else for now.
No problem.